The question of when did I decide to embrace regenerative agriculture is a really interesting question in terms of, for me, regenerative agriculture is not it's not a word, it's not a noun, it's actually an action. Am I someone that's regenerating and on that journey of regeneration? And so for me, I have always been on this journey from my early days. I was fascinated with land function, land systems, erosion, water quality from like the age of 5. So for me, this has always been part of me. And this is why I feel even the terminology of regenerative agriculture is misleading, because people think that it is about practices when actually it's a way of being. How do I interact with the landscape around me? How do I interact with people? Um, how good can we make an ecosystem? How functional? Uh, what's happening with biodiversity, profitability? All of this is something I've been incredibly curious about. I actually started in ecology and soil science and got into composting in my early 20s, and that just opened doorways to working with organic pip fruit production and viticulture in terms of like what is happening with soil health, what is happening with inputs, how do we confront what we can see is coming, which is increased prices, increased volatility of climate. And so this journey for me just keeps expanding. So if I think back to how did I learn how to regenerate ecosystems, was really through some fantastic mentors and producers that had been doing these this approach for a long time. So I think of Bruce Smith, who had been working in viticulture when I first met him, Steve Erickson, who was a composter and whole systems um, thinker, and Thelma Williams, who was involved in avocado production and vermicast. And I was just really blessed early on to have people around me that just walked and talked this. They literally were living a life of regeneration without having a label attached to it. So we began on my father's property. We planted 700 avocado trees. We set up a um, orchard. We restored a wetland ecosystem, riparian planting, and just having that really deep dive into the practical elements of different types of plants and growing different types of plants, and then producing a vermicast, so a worm casting that I started to modify microbially through what I learned from Dr. Elaine Ingham in terms of having a more fungal based vermicast for avocados, and that would be the same for vineyards, and then developing a vermicast that could be used on pasture. So I just was very blessed to have the people that I did have around me and the ability to really experiment and learn. And I think we didn't have the early hurdles that many producers might encounter because I didn't have any restricting mindset about what was possible. So I could, we could try something like vermicast and actually establishing trees and vines in vermicast straight away without having existing systems of maybe degradation or herbicide strips or um, nematode problems, or all of these issues that producers, when they've been running conventionally for a long time, can have that can really slow you down. So my early days of food production, I feel, were were pretty successful in terms of not having things really go wrong. I then started to work in organic pip fruit in the Hawke's Bay, so that's pears and apples. And what I discovered was with the organic pip fruit industry was they were putting huge amounts of organic fungicides on. They were cultivating the ground to manage for insect pressure, and having this whole aha, like, this is not sustainable by any stretch of the imagination. And just because you're certified doesn't mean that you really are looking at the world through an organic lens. And so that shifted the trajectory that I was on and actually opened the doorway to start working with Bruce Nimmin at Kokako Vineyard, who's also in the Hawke's Bay. And that was my first real consulting. I had been really nervous and felt like I don't know enough to be able to go out and tell anyone to do what to do. So I really didn't go and tell them what to do. We worked alongside each other in asking the questions of how do we reduce these inputs profitably, without seeing, vine stress or loss of yield? How do we improve the quality of the grapes that we're producing? And at the time, they had massive herbicide resistance. The ground had previously been potato ground, and they were using up to 6 herbicides a year, and they still can control the weed pressure. And within 2 years of adopting regenerative soil practices, we saw pretty much the elimination of herbicides in most areas, and certainly the elimination of these herbicide resistant weeds. So it was a really great introduction into working alongside people and seeing what could be possible. And I think Bruce Nimmin was the perfect person for me to start that journey on. Yeah, it's interesting when I talk to many viticulturists, the first place that we look to is not what practices need to change, but what is the mindset that needs to change. And I don't say that like we need to change mindset, but bringing in curiosity, like asking the question of why do I have virus? Why do I have powdery mildew or botrytis? What is it that's actually driving disease or pests in the vineyard? Why do I not have any earthworms? Why do I have these herbicide resistant weeds? Why are my inputs going up? Why is the quality of my wine or grapes going down? And so that's where I work with people, is getting really curious. And for me, that is what underpins regenerative agriculture, is curiosity. And so by working with people, we really dig deep into what are some of these drivers, so then we can start to more consciously be proactive in the practices that we're implementing in a way that, and again, it depends on every vineyard. Every viticulturist is an individual. They have different goals. They have different outcomes potentially that they're wanting to see on their properties. And so working with someone, like maybe your main goal is profitability. Okay, let's look at what are we doing? What are we spending? That actually you're just wasting your money. I mean, and what I find is a lot of viticultural practices are just wasteful. And it's because someone's come down the driveway and they've sold you this great product, this great elixir. And now you're on a treadmill of really having to be reactive because potentially that product has created the conditions for more pests, weeds, or diseases. And so by asking the question of, I wonder why, and getting curious about what different actions we can take, we can really start to focus on true nutrition, on vibrant health in the ecosystem, and be asking the questions of like, how do I bring in more pollinator insects? How do I bring in spiders maybe to control different types of pests? Like, what is that ecosystem that I'm creating? So really thinking about your vineyard as an ecosystem and as a place of real health. And it interested me in terms of like, we might do a couple of rows, say in a pollinator, cover crop kind of mix, focusing on biological products, reducing a lot of the really harmful chemicals. And what you find is those are the places that people want to be in. Those are the rows where you'll find people wanting to come in and have picnics and actually be on the vineyard in a more relaxed state. And for me, I think it's a really great, very difficult to measure benefit and outcome from a regenerative approach. I think it's being able to train our minds to get off the prescription and off the calendar kind of approach and look for what is going to work well here. So one of the initial things I see people trying is, interrow cover crops. That might be a soil building mix. It might be something to bring in the beneficial organisms. Um, then seeing people using carbon based, what I call buffers. So using a small amount of a product like a humic acid with your herbicides. And what that does is it increases cell wall permeability. So you can actually increase the efficacy of herbicides that you are using, but by putting it in with a carbon-based food, the microbiology are able to break those compounds down. They're able to feed microbiology while you're doing any kind of action. We also use carbon-based foliars, so they might have a little bit of fulvic acid. I know many of you are probably using seaweeds. Um, there's such a range of biological foods. So thinking every time you're making a pass, instead of what do I need to kill now, what do I need to nourish now? Who am I feeding? What kind of biological populations am I feeding? How do I create an ecosystem that's going to be more well suited to viticulture? So that might be the practices of thinking we need a more fungal dominant environment underneath the vines. Imagine if we could ever go back in time, what vines look like in the wild. They would have been in dappled sunlight. There would have been a lot of mulch kind of materials. It would have been very fungal dominated, as opposed to what you see if you're using things like glyphosate under vine. What you do is you push that vine more bacterial. If you're cultivating those soils, you're pushing it more bacterial, and that's actually not the environment that vines need to flourish. So thinking, how do I allow these vines to rest more in the understory? How do I encourage the companion growth of more herbaceous, low-growing plants that could be growing under the vines, things like alyssum, wild strawberries? Like what was it that would grow naturally underneath vines? Um, the other thing I see is the use of microbial extracts. These could be things people are making from their own compost or vermicast. We might be using metabolite products. So those are the byproducts of microbial activity. There's some really good metabolite products on the market that can be used in any viticultural system. You don't need to change your spray nozzles or anything like that. And so I feel like in the first couple of years, I like to kind of wean off the high chem system, switching out for some of the biological biocontrols. So we have biologicals, for instance, that can control a huge range of insect pests. There's different types of cordyceps. There's metarhizium. There's what we call entomopathogenic fungi that specifically will target groups of organisms, pest organisms. So if we apply a foliar, these these microbes will actually live as an endophyte inside the vine. So then if something comes to chew on it, it will get infected by this mushroom that will then grow, or this fungus that will grow inside that insect and kill it, and then return those nutrients to the vines, which is pretty cool. So there are many products now that can help people transition until you get to that year 4 or 5, where you really feel like you can start to refine what you're doing now and pull back on a lot of the soluble ferts. And I think that's probably some of the biggest challenges that are really fun to pull out, is like, do you need all those trace elements? Do you need all that nitrogen when what it takes is a healthy, functional vine with well-established root systems and a microbial population? So think of that microbiome as really being the gut of the vines. And if your gut is dysfunctional, which is what we find in most vineyards, is you have a totally dysfunctional gut. That those, you could think of those vines as either having constipation or diarrhea or or Crohn's disease. So literally those vines are no longer able to take up the nutrients that they need for optimal health, and that happens through a biological relationship. So I think if you're thinking about a prescription, the prescription is, who am I feeding? How do I maximize my underground livestock and get them to do the work for me? Certainly, there's a very close interrelated relationship between the health of soil to the health of vines. And what we've seen in the past is this need to feel like you've got to stress vines for quality. And there is a piece about this, but it is still having a fungal dominated environment. And I really encourage producers to get SAP meters that you can use in field. One of those would be a SAP pH meter. One would be a SAP EC standing for electrical conductivity. And the the refractometer that you're using to sample grapes, you can use to sample the leaves as well. Although that can be quite challenging to get sap, I know, out of grapevines. So having a specific press that you can get sap out of, and starting to monitor what is the current heartbeat of my vineyard, what is happening with health, with nutrient dynamics. Those 3 meters will tell you a lot about the overall health of a vine. And the pH in the sap of any vine should be 6.4. And what I'm seeing is sap levels around 3 to 3.6, which, I mean, you're getting close to battery acid at that point. When we see vine pH sap be that low, you are going to see diseases, you are going to see insect attack, you will see viruses. And what we've noticed is every time you apply a fungicide, you watch your sap pH will drop. So go out and do this for yourself. And so the fungicides themselves are actually creating the conditions for more pests and diseases, which is a great sales point if you're involved in selling fungicides, but it's not a great sales point for those interested in creating healthy, dynamic vines. So I really recommend that you do get these meters, that you start to monitor the overall health. And I know you're doing this on so many levels already in vineyards, but really thinking, how do I optimize the health of this plant? Because the plant is interacting with the soil and building soil health, and the soil is responding to the plant. So it's a chicken and egg situation. But there is absolutely and inextricably a relationship between pests, weeds, and diseases and soil health and vine health. And so if you are dealing with any diseases, then ask the question of what makes my plant vulnerable? Is there something to do with trace elements? Is there something to do with the overall health and the ability of this plant to photosynthesize? And again, bringing that wonder and that curiosity into diagnosing, why is this plant not as functional and able to express itself to its full genetic potential? And if I use Bruce at Kokako as an example, he lifted the quality of his wine production from basically cask wine to premium just through a focus on microbiology. And if you think about flavor profiles, why we think that glyphosate should be the terroir and the flavor profile in wine just baffles me. We should be thinking the microbiology themselves are the ones that really enhance our flavor profiles. So a focus on microbiology and their relationships, I think, is going to be the whole next realm of exploration in viticulture. Is what are the microbes doing? How do they influence flavor profiles? And getting really curious about this too, because that's what's putting money in your bank account, I imagine. It's something I'm passionate about, is what are the barriers to uptake to something that makes so much sense? Like, it makes so much sense from a financial perspective, it makes so much sense from an ecological perspective and a human health perspective, and yet there's still a resistance. And when you look at what's behind it, it's the structures that hold this in place. And those structures are the ease of, calendar spraying, of prescriptions, of products, of the supply companies that people are talking to. And those are not the people I'm working with. I work with incredibly innovative, progressive thinkers. And as of now, we no longer consult or work directly with producers. We are working with organizations and designing programs. And those programs really do work with people in terms of, where are you at right now? What's really important to you? What do you value? And ensuring that we hold onto those values as we transition into a regenerative agroecological system. So if the value of having something that's really simple to implement is important to you, then how do we create a system that does that? So I don't feel like I deal with people that are incredibly resistant, and I certainly don't feel like I need to make or convince or do any of that for people. This is up to an individual's choice in terms of what do they want to do, and we're seeing more market signals that this is where the industry needs to go. So either you fight that and you put your heels in and you make it harder and harder in order to comply with many of these new rules, or you become someone that's on the edge who's actually really innovating and can feel passionate and creative about what you're doing in the landscape now. And that's what I'm seeing is there's a global shift towards um, I think in every single sector of producers that are really asking this question of like, how good can we get it? How subtle can we be? How little does it take in order to just support that plant in that plant being able to do its job and then get out of the way? Because most of what we're doing is actually undermining a plant's ability to flourish. And so, yeah, I just feel like this is a wave that's coming hard and fast, and I'm less interested in people that feel resistant. um, I really do recommend that if you're not sure and you're feeling nervous about a transition, then you need to go and see people that have been on this track for a while, who've really simplified it, who can really demonstrate the benefits for vine health and soil health, who are in a similar ecotype as you. But even, just to travel the world and see what people are doing in Australia and New Zealand, Europe, Africa. What are people doing to innovate and find those solutions that you see that are going to fit well within your programs? And just dip your toe in, and just, even if you just wanted to trial a couple of rows and just get some confidence, get those monitoring tools, whatever it's going to take for you to see um, what the benefits are. Absolutely, we're seeing the growth and expansion of these principles, practices, philosophy around the world. It is a global paradigm shift, and it's happening right now. And every single region that I go to, you will find people that are doing a really good job. You're going to find some areas are stronger and have more innovators. And it's not even the innovators, actually. We're talking about the center part of society is moving more and more towards this, in terms of, are you actually interested in stewardship? Do you want to hand your land on to someone else when you pass? What is your legacy? What are we leaving behind? And right now, I think there's a lot to not be proud of in terms of chemical residues and the chemical legacy that we're leaving for our great grandchildren. And I think people are getting more connected to what's actually important. And this is why I think it is really valuable to travel. And one of the most powerful things is speaking our truth. We know that one of the most powerful things in every agricultural sector is peer pressure. We're calling it the social squeeze. So actually using that peer pressure for good, instead of keeping people small and keeping people in the ranks and have everyone do the same thing. Let's embrace diversity and diversity of thought, and starting to speak up in our communities if there's something that that is really not working well and perhaps is compromising the health of people working in viticulture and the health of the overall sector. Then starting to speak up in a way that is not unkind, but just like sharing what you're doing, using all of those social media platforms to share images, share your stories, and just have that confidence to start to speak up, because there are so many people doing this right now that maybe feel like they might be judged, or what would the neighbors think, when actually none of that's important, and you're the neighbor speaking the other way as well. So it's time for us all to be speaking up about what we're doing. I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me. This is a fantastic event and it's been a real pleasure. So, all the best.